I'm Bradley Handelaar, Senior Associate at Danos Consulting, and today I'm joined by Steve Walton for today's Pathway to Success podcast. Steve is a risk expert with over 30 years experience in the industry, working for some of the largest financial institutions such as JP Morgan, Deutsche, and Bank of America. In more recent years, as a Chief Risk Officer, Steve has begun working across well-established organisations within insurance, asset management and the pension space globally. Steve will give us an insight into his career journey, the struggles he's overcome, the advice he would give young risk professionals, and what he's seeing going on in the risk landscape today. So, Steve, thanks for joining me today.
Good. Thanks for having me, Bradley.
First question is, how did you first get into risk?
Ironically, I took a bit of a risk. I guess I'd spent quite a lot of time doing a variety of roles at JP Morgan at the time. I then moved to Deutsche and helped them develop some of their internal audit practice. And then I was offered a role working for Stuart Lewis, who at the time was the Deputy Chief Risk Officer, as his COO. And it was a bit of a leap of faith, really, because I'd spent a lot of time working with risk professionals, but not actually doing the day-to-day risk activities. And it was quite an interesting point. It was just after the financial crisis, lots of change, driven by both regulatory transformation, but also the company themselves really thinking about how it wanted to develop its risk management practice. I think very quickly I realized that being a little bit closer to the action and also doing a role where the world was changing quite quickly and one's perception of what was needed, particularly post-financial crisis, was dramatically different to what it was pre. I think risk historically had been populated by a lot of people that had some very deep technical expertise in particular risk disciplines. The financial crisis showed that whilst you could be particularly strong in a discipline, some of the breadth of being able to sort of join the dots was actually what been missed. Correlations and the interconnectedness between different parts of the business and different risk types was something that people maybe hadn't recognized as much as they should have. The world is changing, and that means that you're never really doing something that you've exactly done before. And that makes the role interesting, challenging, and each day brings something new to think about.
Do you kind of then start to take a long look forward and think, if I'm going to make my career in risk, well, what are the steps for me to go to? Is where I want to go to being a chief risk officer? Is that the next aim? And how do I do that? Is that kind of what the aim became?
I don't think I'd really set out with a sort of a long-term objective saying, I want to be a CRO. I think it became quite obvious quite quickly that the chief risk officer role, or in some organizations, that enterprise risk management role is one that probably played to my strengths. I knew sort of a little about an awful lot of things. I understood and had exposure to a variety of businesses in big financial services firms. So connecting the dots and recognizing the interdependencies, connectedness across organizations was something that I was probably stronger at than a lot of people. And my deep technical expertise, I didn't need to have that so much to have a CRO. You need to be able to make sure that you could build and develop and manage teams, and be able to recognize the strengths and the capabilities that you have in your team and be able to deploy that where most needed.
As a chief risk officer, what kind of issues did you kind of encounter?
It became very apparent to me that culture is has such a huge role in being successful being risk management. Without the right culture, you can have the best technical risk framework in the world, and it will fail. You need to have that relationship between the various lines of defense, if that's sort of the model that you look at. But ultimately, you need to be able to have trust and confidence between the business and the risk managers. You be able to retain your integrity. You need to have empathy. So a lot of the humanities become really important. It is more often than not about people and the relationships they have, and the willingness to listen and be creative. Also have your integrity to stand by what is the right thing to do under some extreme pressure. Sometimes the framework as such is can be redeployed across many different elements of certain financial services. It's not really that different, in terms of the technical framework elements, but ultimately the culture and the governance that sits underneath that has got to be well established to be successful.
And what the key trends are at the moment?
Yeah, I probably split it into sort of two key points. The impact of that remote working on the development and ongoing, sort of processes that the teams have been operating under can be quite stark. And relationships that have been working really, really well for many years, the longer that those people are remote from each other, you can see the sort of dilution a little bit in the strength of those relationships, and operating at best through video, but quite often through email, is sometimes tests people's understanding of what the other perspective can be. Getting the balance between some of the good things that have come out from remote working, the resilience that companies have from that, but being able to to re-establish some of those strong operating relationships in the new post-pandemic world will be a key focus for a number of things. And then also, I think the second point is really around some of the more technical risk management changes that have either been companies have recognized themselves that they need to change around how they really operate in a resilient way, or are being forced on them by regulatory change, such as ICAP to ICARA.
Yep.
I think this, when it comes to that approach of ICARA in the future, or ORSAs, or whatever the local regulatory jurisdictional version of it is, it's still, I think, for a lot of firms, a bit of a paper exercise rather than really sort of being a living, breathing core risk management embedded into the risk management organization. I think that's still an area where lots of firms will need to focus.
Final kind of question for me is taking yourself back and maybe when you made your transition, as you said, from audit into risk, what would you kind of give people in that position as kind of maybe some advice as to maybe how to go forward in their career in risk?
Two things that I probably reflect a lot on are one is around listening, really, and being able to understand the context and the objective. More often than not, people don't come to work to do a bad job. They pretty much everybody wants to do their best, and quite often when it's easy to look at something and think it's wrong, but if you're not understanding what they're trying to do and the incentives or the objectives they've got. So taking the time to listen and understand what those other people are thinking allows you to be able to have a certain amount of empathy for what they're trying to achieve, but also to hopefully work together and fulfill both objectives. The objective of the person trying to do, but your own objective as a risk manager. So it's really important to sort of understand their perspective and be able to put yourselves in their shoes. And the second thing is inevitably there'll be times where you're going to have to reflect on your integrity, and to some extent that's around culture. And as a risk manager, you're often put in quite challenging positions, and you've got to put yourself in what's the right thing for the company and your role, and that means that you've got to think about sometimes saying no. And whilst quite often that can lead into a really interesting conversation about it's no, but maybe there's another way. Sometimes it will just be no.
Yeah.
And that is, doing that and being able to retain, the confidence and the trust and the relationships you've established is sometimes quite difficult, but I think can be done. And that's where you need to think a little bit about the tools in your personal kit as to how you can achieve that without obviously getting into a confrontational or aggressive sort of stance. Which inevitably always ends up with the wrong result.
Some good points there. Really appreciate the time. Hopefully people can watch this and take some good key points away and some advice as well from someone like yourself. So thanks again for your time. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Bradley. Thank